Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for turning out this afternoon. We expect today's conference to offer engaging commentary, insightful words of wisdom, and something that I think we're all going to benefit and enjoy. We've got remarks coming from 2 keynote speakers and 3 terrific panels for you this afternoon. So whether you're here with us in the room or whether you're watching on the live stream, thank you very much for tuning in for the conference at the Turning Point, Economics, Security, and American Politics. My name is Stephanie Kelton. I am the chair of the board at Economists for Peace and Security. I took this position at the start of the year after Professor Jamie Galbraith stepped down after many years of tremendous leadership with this important organization. And so I want to get our panel on just as quickly as possible, but first I would like to invite Jamie to say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and I'm instructed by the chair to remind you to turn off electronic devices. I'm James Galbraith. I'm very pleased to be able to say a few words, actually on behalf of the co-hosts of this event, the LBJ School of Public Affairs, its Washington Center, which is just next door, and the Lloyd Benson Chair. Economists for Peace and Security and the LBJ School have been parallel threads in my life for well over 20 years, and this is just the first occasion, I believe, in which the threads have been woven together in a single event. A premise of EPS, shared independently by the LBJ School, is that American economic and global political security are linked, that successful economic institutions and policies enable world peace, while mistakes, misunderstanding, mischance, mischief, and simple failures on the economic front engender instability, conflict, another danger, as surely as the Versailles Treaty set the conditions for fascism and the Second World War. In that context, we are now 10 years after the start of the great financial crisis, and we should perhaps acknowledge how little we have assimilated our present situation and how far down a similar road we are already traveling. Much of the world has abandoned the economic ideologies that were fashionable a generation ago and that underpinned and brought into its extreme manifestation, the financial crisis. These ideologies, known widely as neoliberal ideologies, those who have not abandoned them in Europe as well as in this country, have either fared relatively poorly or recovered in an unbalanced and precarious way, while advancing policies, the familiar trio of deregulation, privatization, and tax cuts, that merely echo ideas that were fashionable and that had some cachet 40 years ago, as though nothing has happened since then. It's famously been said that history occurs once as tragedy, a second time as farce, and we should perhaps take note that by the third or fourth time you're well into the domain of kitsch. And that's where we are on the discussion of much of the current economic policy agenda. Our task today is to frame an understanding of the world situation and of our economy as they are now, in this period since the crisis, taking account of the instability, of the inequality, of the fragility of the system, and of the social, economic, resource, and climate challenges that we know are already upon us. It is to advance a necessary project of new economic and security analysis and to ask what is to be done. Well, to evoke a memorable phrase from an earlier era, We have for us, for our first panel, a very distinguished group of specialists in the security area, and I would simply say, let us begin. Thank you very much indeed, and I yield the floor to the chair of the panel, Mehdi Hasan.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. My name is Mehdi Hasan. I am a host with Al Jazeera English, a columnist with The Intercept, an adjunct professor at Georgetown. It's a privilege to be here with you all. Thank you for the invitation to Economists for Peace and Security in the LBJ School. It's great to be here. I think it's the 10th annual policy symposium. A good time to be talking about foreign policy. Not much happening in the world these days, right? It's all quiet out there. Nothing to discuss or debate. We have a stellar panel here to talk about some of the issues that are dominating both Washington, D.C. and foreign capitals. We're here to talk about the foreign policy of the 45th president of the United States of America. Many of you, like me, will have seen him at the weekend in Vietnam, heaping praise on Vladimir Putin of Russia, telling us that he believes the former KGB spy chief when he says that he did not meddle in the US election. What was interesting, I thought, and I don't know, when we have the discussion, it's interesting how President Trump is very clear where he stands on certain issues, especially when it comes to lying. Just for the record, before we go any further, I just wanted to remind you all, for President Trump, Hillary Clinton is a liar, Barack Obama is a liar, James Comey is a liar, the media are liars, judges are liars, climate change scientists are liars, the widow of a Navy SEAL is a liar, and all of the women who accused him of sexual assault are liars. But one person isn't a liar, and that is Vladimir Putin of Russia. So we're very clear where the president stands, but what we're not clear about is what does he want to get done in the world. Yesterday, interestingly enough, Benjamin Netanyahu revealed to his cabinet that he received a letter from the President of the United States saying, "Thank you for your support after my UN speech. Together, we will confront Iran." President Trump wrote to the Prime Minister of Israel, we discovered yesterday. So that makes this discussion rather topical and timely. Hating Iran, hugging Russia. Does Trump have a coherent foreign policy? That's the very easy question we have for our panelists today. Without any further ado, let me introduce them very briefly. Matthew Duss is a senior foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. He was formerly the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace here in Washington, D.C. He also served for several years as a senior national security analyst at the Center for American Progress. To my left is Heather Hurlburt, who is a foreign policy columnist for New York Magazine, co-host of the Dresbert podcast. She's worked at the White House, State Department, Capitol Hill, currently in charge of the New Models of Policy Change Initiative at New America. And to my right, last but not least, is Bill Hartung, director of the Arms and Security Project for the Center for International Policy, author of Prophets of War, Lockheed Martin, and the Making of the Military Complex. Those are your panelists. I'm going to have them give some brief statements to kick off the discussion. Then they're going to have a chat amongst themselves. Then we're going to open it up to all of you. We've got 45 minutes. We're going to keep it to time, hopefully. Matt, I'm going to ask you to kick off with some brief remarks, trying to address our question today.
Sure, and thank you, Mehdi, and thanks to the panelists, and thanks to the conference for inviting me to speak here today. I just want to preface by saying these views are mine. I'm speaking for myself alone. This analysis, just a few thoughts on a couple of the ideas here. One is, what is Trump's foreign policy? And I think then a few comments related specifically, to Russia and Iran and how these two things are related, because I think they are related in a very interesting way. The one with regard to Trump and his foreign policy, I think I would definitely grant that the way he's gone out there, I mean, let me just say this. I think the way he's approached foreign policy is very much the way he's approached domestic policy, which is to say there's people out there, they're trying to screw you. They're taking advantage of you. They're taking advantage of us, and we're going to go out there and do it to them instead. We see this the way he talks about multilateral organizations, NATO, the UN, various trade deals. We're going to do bilateral agreements and get a much better deal. The Iran agreement, they got taken advantage of. Obama got taken advantage of. It was the worst deal ever. I'm going to get back in there. I'm the super deal maker. I'm going to get a much better deal for America. But I think on top of that, it is really so while I think certainly we can say that Trump has departed from some of the kind of, U.S. commitment to kind of global governance and multilateralism, this is not entirely new. I think he's sort of mobilizing a constituency and a tendency that has been cultivated for many years by conservative rhetoric and, frankly, conservative policymaking here in Washington. Let's look at his Warsaw speech, which I think a lot of people recognized as a kind of shocking, pain to the alt-right. Does the West have the will to survive, I think was one of the quotes coming out of that Warsaw speech. Now, for all the criticisms of Trump we're seeing from kind of the mainstream right, that speech was roundly praised in the mainstream conservative press. The National Review, the Weekly Standard, you name the mainstream publication, they loved that speech. And this is because I think it echoed something we've seen from the right even before 9/11, but definitely immediately post 9/11, which was this kind of clash of civilizations narrative. And this is something I think that was leveraged very, very aggressively, particularly after Barack Obama was elected, as a way to kind of mobilize opposition to him. This clash of civilizations narrative, this idea that Obama was not really American, that Obama is out there to undermine America. In fact, Senator Marco Rubio in the primary campaign, said this explicitly: Obama is intentionally trying to weaken America. So I think in this case, as in many other cases, Trump has really just taken a dog whistle and turned it into an outright whistle. But the fact is, this rhetoric over many years has really developed its own constituency, and so I think he's been mobilizing that. I'd love to chat about that more, but let me get into specifically Russia and Iran. Now, if you go back to the primary, it's interesting because I think Trump was among the least aggressive toward Iran. He was someone who was very, very slow to say that he was going to tear up the deal. He at least had kind of, at least a commitment to the idea that a deal was made, and so we should try to make the best of it. Eventually, he came around to the actual mainstream conservative deal, which is that view, which is that it's a horrible deal, and when we should do whatever we can to get out of it. Although he hasn't really acted on that as president, because I think the adults in his administration have made clear what a bad idea that is. But I think as he's kind of moved toward this very aggressive anti-Iran posture and really slow-walked efforts to react and create consequences for Russia's intervention in the election, I think we should look at the situation we've got in the Middle East right now, and we've just seen over the past few weeks, I think it was in early November, where you had Putin making a trip to Tehran, the announcement of billions of dollars in energy deals between Gazprom and Rosneft and other projects, relating to India, China. As Trump has, acted to, create, let's say, uncertainty about the Iran nuclear agreement, he's actually created a wide open space economically for Russia in its relationship with Iran. If we can step back, I think President Obama's vision, and it's one I happen to agree with, that by, building trust and getting a deal on this one specific issue, the nuclear issue, this might create an opening, for better relations, economic relations between Europe and Iran, and hopefully eventually the United States, to make Iran a more responsible actor in the region. And the way to do that was to try and bind them slowly economically to Europe and give them a stake. But in doing what he's been doing, Trump has really chilled that relationship, or the prospect of that relationship improving, as it created a real opportunity for Russia, and Russia is taking great advantage of that right now. So I think that's one example of how going hostile to Iran is actually benefiting Russia considerably.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Heather, do you want to pick up where Matt left off?
Sure, and I really want to congratulate the organizers. It's really rare that a conference is so timely that I can get up in the morning and do my conference prep by getting into fights on Twitter. So I hope you think that's a compliment. But I want to start actually and do that thing that one never does on panels, and that is actually answer Mehdi's question. And this, I would say I'd had a lot of fun, except that I have to live here, over the last year, sort of debating this question of, does our president have anything that can be described as a coherent foreign policy? And what I think we overlook over and over again, and I'll really be building on some of the things that Matt said, is that there are a very consistent set of impulses or core beliefs, or I don't like to dignify them with the word values, but core values that animate his policy and decision-making in quite predictable ways. And the most important one, which I think has been the most overlooked and the least understood, because it is something that we haven't seen in over half a century have any influence in American foreign policy making, and that is the value of national sovereignty as a goal in and of itself. And this is an idea that really puts him in what I'll call the Ted Cruz wing of the Republican Party, as opposed to the neoconservative or even the sort of paleoconservative wings, that actual, as opposed to saying U.S. foreign policy, U.S. security policy is about growth, or it's about sustainability, which might be something that many folks on the left might think, or it's about freedom, whatever that means and whoever it's for. This is really, if you look at the commentary, it is about sovereignty as an end in itself. And for some thinkers, I'm not going to try to argue that our president fits in this category, but there is a well-developed subsegment of conservative thought which argues, sort of has a constitutional view of foreign policy and national security, which is very, very limiting in terms of what the U.S. can bind itself to or do overseas. If it's not foreseen in the Constitution, you can't do it. And this is, it's a real rejection of everything the left, the center left, and the neoconservative right have tried to do ever since the end of World War II, basically. And I think we sometimes give that short shrift in discussing Trump's foreign policy. Now, the reason that this matters, it may sound kind of esoteric, but when you combine that with this being a president who isn't interested, to put it mildly, in institutions, and at every turn where he's able to choose between the rule of law and personalized autocracy, goes for personalized autocracy. When you put those two tendencies together, and then you then realize sovereignty of whom for what, you have created a worldview which is, frankly, very naturally at home with Putin's Russia and MBS's Saudi Arabia and some other illiberal regimes that we've seen arise around the world in recent years. And one challenge I would throw out to this gathering is that we really haven't seen enough, frankly, intellectual effort on how the economics and the security policy of this is really tightly intertwined. And in fact, someday we won't have two separate panels. I think I've said this here before. Someday we won't have two separate panels on these subjects because on the economic side, policies that promote inequality also undercut not just democratic institutions, but they undercut popular support for democracy, and they heighten popular support for autocracy and personalized rule, thus creating a nice little cycle for you. And we've now got someone in power in our country, as in other countries, who can use the levers of economic policy, but also the levers of security policy to sort of further push and tighten that cycle. And then the third point that gets left out as a driver of security policy, because frankly we in the center left and left don't tend to see it as a quote unquote security issue, but to the president and his supporters, the clash of civilizations is a security issue that can be sort of broken down to a racialized us versus them. And the whole edifice is dependent on that racialized us versus them. If you take it away, you don't really have a policy anymore. And you saw that most vividly in the Warsaw speech, as Matt says, and not enough people have taken a look at that. But you also, even on the Asia trip, the sort of, China needs to watch out for Japan because Japan has a samurai culture. Well, if you know anything about Asian history, you might want to leave that one alone. Or, I think the wonderful comment that since I left Japan and South Korea, they're both getting along with each other better, which kind of manages to pack all three of the personalization, the sovereigntism, and the sort of racializing and us versus them-ness of what security really is. So I would suggest that those three qualities are both quite consistent across his foreign policy and quite frighteningly unlike even those tendencies in American foreign policy that many of us in this room have stood to oppose in previous years. And I'll leave it there and we can get into it in the discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. I was actually quite impressed that Donald Trump knew that samurai warriors were from Japan. I thought that was an achievement of itself.
Now, that is the soft bigotry of low expectations that we will not be having.
We grade him on that curve. Bill, last but not least, does he have a coherent foreign policy?
Is this on?
Yes.
Oh, good. Well, I think it's kind of coherently incoherent or predictably contradictory. If you look at North Korea, his people, Secretary Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, will periodically say, military is the last resort, we need to talk, of course we're looking at diplomacy. Trump himself occasionally says this, so I can talk to this guy, I can make a deal, But then he turns around and says, we're going to inflict fire and fury like has never been seen before, we're going to destroy the country. He starts calling them names, which I'm not going to repeat because why repeat a tweet? And so, where is it heading in the midst of all that contradictory rhetoric, I think is a question that's unclear. Unfortunately, one area where he has been consistent is going all in favor of the Saudi regime and their dangerous and provocative policies. And it doesn't seem to matter what they do. I mean, he signaled early on that unlike before he ran for president, when he said the Saudis were behind 9/11, they were cheating us like everybody else in the world, even though actually they pay for their weapons. We're not giving them away. But nonetheless, that was kind of his take. Once he became president, one of the first things he did was lift a suspension on the sale of precision-guided munitions that happened at the end of the Obama administration because of the Saudis' indiscriminate bombing of civilians in Yemen. So that was the first signal. Then, of course, he went to Saudi Arabia on his first foreign trip, and he was greeted with great fanfare. They projected his image onto the hotel he was staying at, and there was banners of him all up and down the highway, and they brought over Toby Keith to do a concert. And, of course, he put his hand over that glowing orb during the initiation of a Saudi anti-terror center, which is one of the funnier ideas. And so, they buttered him up. And, of course, he said, well, it's all about deals. I have $110 billion in arms sales. Of course, if you looked at them, a lot of them were concluded under Obama. A lot of them were speculative. But they wanted a nice big number to throw at the wall. And, in fact, they had a meeting where Jared called the head of Lockheed Martin and said, what do you got? We got to build up this package. What can I talk about? So a lot of this was for domestic political consumption. But, as soon as he left, and the Saudi regime certainly felt emboldened by his seemingly unconditional support, one of the first things they did was start a blockade against Qatar. And they said it was about terrorism, but, of course, it was primarily about that they weren't on board with the Saudi line about Iran. He wanted them to close Al Jazeera, which, of course, criticizes the Saudis periodically. So, there was that. More recently, when he threw all these folks, well, not in jail, but in a hotel, Trump said, well, they've been milking Saudi Arabia forever, and this is a good thing. So he basically accepted this notion that it was about corruption, not about Mohammed bin Salman consolidating his power. And then he spoke to the king while this was going on, and he didn't mention this at all, although the readout from the White House said he did thank them for buying U.S. missile defense systems. So there's kind of this jobs element, there's this I'm a deal maker element, there's this they were nice to me element, and of course there's a lot of anti-Iran sentiment, overt and covert in his administration, which complicates this matter even further. So, what are the dangers of this? Well, as we're seeing in Lebanon, the Saudis seem to be wanting to break this fragile coalition government, which has potentially disastrous consequences. Some are saying, well, the Israelis are going to bomb. Some Israelis say, well, why would we do that? They've got all these missiles, and they would like us to, fight Hezbollah to the last Israeli, is what was one comment. But that's certainly being discussed in Israel, and Saudi Arabia is not going to do it themselves because they're tied up using their air force in Yemen to commit what Representative Ted Lewis described as war crimes. So they're going to escalate in Yemen as they're doing, the Saudis. They're tightening the blockade, which has already caused 7 million people to be on the brink of famine. Their bombing of civilian infrastructure has led to the biggest cholera outbreak in modern times. And Trump is all fine with this. And in fact, he doesn't mention it as a problem. Mattis did say in his first trip to the region that we have to solve this and we have to get the UN involved. But that didn't get a lot of coverage, and it doesn't seem to be getting a lot of oomph in terms of convincing Donald Trump. And then, of course, there's the question of, will this lead to some sort of military engagement with Iran? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if the Saudis are going to escalate using their financial wealth, or they just want to tighten sanctions on Iran, whether there'd be some sort of naval incident. Very unclear. I mean, the problem is, if you take a reckless 32-year-old leader and a reckless 70-year-old leader and you throw them together, you don't know for sure what you're going to get. The last thing I'll say is just a footnote on the jobs issue. When Trump was in Japan, he once again talked about all these great arms sales that he was making there, including the sale of F-35 combat aircraft. Well, that deal was first concluded in 2012. Last time I checked, Trump wasn't president then. And also, of course, he bragged about the jobs. But in that instance, the planes are going to be built at a final assembly plant in Japan. Not only the Japanese planes, but other planes that are sold in Asia will be assembled there. So this, if anything, is an example of exporting jobs, not creating jobs in the United States. But I think probably Trump may not have been lying in this case. I think he probably wasn't briefed on it. Because for a deal maker, he doesn't seem to be the kind of guy who reads the fine print. So I'll leave it at that, and
okay,
we can talk.
Well, let me kick off the discussion by asking you this, Bill. You mentioned he's coherently incoherent, which I think is a good description, given he has no actual values, either at home or abroad. But where does that leave the rest of the world, in particular America's quote-unquote enemies? If you are sitting in Pyongyang or Tehran and your job is to analyze the United States, is the United States a threat to your regime, a threat to your existence? How do you then make sense of a Trump tweet or a Trump speech or a Trump interview where he says bombastic, belligerent, aggressive stuff, which we know he doesn't mean. He hasn't been briefed on. He just wants to sound tough or sound impressive. How much does it mean that we're actually more likely to go to war inadvertently, accidentally, on his watch because he's coherently incoherent?
I think that's the biggest problem. I mean, he rarely communicates in other than tweets or just on the run comments. And, you know, a charitable view would say, well, it's just deterrence. He's just using tougher rhetoric. It's like, don't mess with us or we'll wipe you out. But the rhetoric matters, you know, and Trump, I think, doesn't really realize that. You know, he says he likes to be unpredictable. Well, nuclear policy is the last place you want to be unpredictable because you don't know how your adversary is going to react. And so in that sense, I think it's a huge problem. Just that very fact that, as you said, the adversary doesn't know what's coming, and they're liable to take some sort of rash action thinking that they have to hit first or in self-defense or so forth. So I think North Korea is an extreme case, but I think it's going to be true in others as well.
And Matt, just picking up on the tough rhetoric point that Bill made, you mentioned in your remarks this idea of, you know, he takes the domestic model of you're getting screwed, these are not good deals, I'm going to protect you, and goes out into the world to do that. The irony is, in his actual, 11 months in office, 10 months in office. Abroad, he's actually been a bit of a pussycat. I mean, you see these tours he does. There was a great video online. Someone stitched together the remarks about China when he was a candidate versus what he said in Beijing last week. You know, on the campaign trail, it was, they're raping us. Mm-hmm. And then when he went there, he said, we had such a great dinner. I love your wife. It was wonderful. We had a great time. You're such great friends. This idea that actually, if you put out a red carpet for him, like the Chinese did, like the Saudis did, like the Israelis did, you get to play the President of the United States. You get to get what you want from the President of the United States. Right. He's actually not that tough. Right. So if you're the Israelis, you get to build as many settlements. If you're the Saudis, you get to carry on, starting fights with Qatar, Yemen, Lebanon, whatever. Chinese, whatever. Is that a fair analysis?
That seems to be the case. I mean, I was kind of joking the other day that if you wanted to create a more friendly Iran policy, just put Trump in a room with the supreme leader. Yeah. Because he would immediately, when confronted with this person who he's been railing against, seems to be the case, he will immediately decide that there's another approach he needs to take.
Also, he'll love the title supreme leader. Well, why can't I have that title?
Certainly he does.
In the U.S.
Is that trademarked? Or,
But yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about, does Trump have values? The one value that I can see, and others around the world seem to have understood this very, very quickly. The one value is that Trump is great, and that if you
sign up to that,
if you can sign up for that and help him reify repeatedly the ways in which Trump is great, then this is going to be an easy touch for you. And I think that's proven over and over again. But I think, kind of connecting that to his domestic and now foreign policy, which is that he sees himself as the embodiment of,
But on the embodiment point, of course, every president of the United States has had this kind of free hand abroad. Presidents of the United States have much more power abroad than they do at home, where Congress is less interested. Partisan division ends at the water's edge, all that nonsensical stuff. This guy's taking it to a new extreme. You work in the Senate, etc. When you look at the media, when you look at the institutions, when you look at the people around them, the so-called grown-ups in the room who aren't that grown up, how much checks are there on this guy abroad? I mean, I look at it and I worry that actually he could just kick off anything tomorrow, and Mattis is not going to stop him. Paul Ryan's not going to stop him. The Washington Post editorial board is not going to stop him.
Well, I would take Iran and North Korea just for two examples. One is, he eventually was brought around to bashing the deal as hard as he could. He talks it down every chance he gets, but what did he do when he actually needed to do something? He gave a big blustery speech and basically kicked it to Congress to do something, to help, and threatened if you don't do something, then there will be consequences. So that's sort of the situation we are now. If he really thought the deal was as bad as he said, he didn't need to kick it to Congress at all. He could have just withdrawn from the deal himself and borne the consequences. He didn't want to do that. On North Korea, I think it's sort of the same thing. You'll see him make these remarks, tweet out these tweets, but at the same time, we know his administration is also supporting some back-channel negotiations, and I think that's positive. I think it's worth acknowledging that. I mean, those are two examples where I feel like he has been kind of convinced, or at least, has allowed some of the adults to carry the day.
Heather, just picking up on what Matt said in his opening remarks about where Trump fits in within kind of hawkish conservative circles. You mentioned kind of the Ted Cruz wing and bringing back the idea of national sovereignty. How sui generis is Trump when it comes to conservative, hawkish foreign policy? Because during the campaign we were told, this guy is so different. He's going to be an isolationist. He's going to take on the neocons. He's going to kind of be balanced on Israel-Palestine. Turns out in office, he's got John Bolton whispering in his ear, and he's allowing Netanyahu to run. He doesn't seem to be that far outside the conservative hawkish mainstream.
Well, look, I mean, to be honest, people were engaging in kind of crazy fantasies during the campaign, and let's just stipulate that to start. And he's not sui generis at all if you know anything about American history, and particularly in the immediately pre- and post-World War II period. He comes from a long, if not at all honorable tradition, which, as Matt remarked, he's not even embarrassed about invoking. With America First, that there's a very, very specific, very problematic, and very, I just keep coming back to this, he has values and they're bad. You embrace America First, you don't get to be dismissed as a values-neutral person. You are not value-neutral in any way. So I really get very frustrated at people's insistence that he's this kind of morally indifferent actor. He's not morally indifferent, but... So if we understand that maybe something that we didn't see for 50 years is that American conservatism has always had within it a highly interventionist wing and a highly non-interventionist wing, which share a great fondness for violence and a great disdain for constraints imposed by external or foreign-looking rules-based order, and you can kind of plot that on a curve. So in that sense, Trump is still kind of well within the norm, if one can use that word, of right of center foreign policy thought in the U.S. over the last 70 years. What's different is that the Republican establishment made really sure that nobody who had doubts about NATO or who had doubts about multilateral trade, or who had doubts about the Asian alliances, or frankly who didn't understand nuclear deterrence or wasn't willing to be advised by people who understood nuclear deterrence, got anywhere near running anything. And so he legitimately represents people who were told by the Republican Party for decades, we want you, we just want you to shut up about what you think and not embarrass us. And he is saying very loudly things that somewhere between 10 and 30% of the American electorate has been thinking all these years. So he's in no way sui generis, but it's also wrong to think this is the same thing as what we got with H.W. Bush.
Although interestingly, it's interesting if you look at the polling, how he's managed to actually switch the minds of Republican voters. So I think a year ago, 18 months ago, Republican voters were very hawkish on Russia, very anti-Putin. Yes. And now because he isn't, they've followed his lead and become much softer on Putin. And you have Alabama Republicans saying this week they trust Putin over the Washington Post.
Well, this is the other thing that is quite different from other moments in American history. The extent to which we are eagerly consuming partisanized cues. So that I do think a majority of Republican voters don't necessarily share his particular brand of views on how to approach the world, but neither do they care enough about the issues to, I mean, if they don't care about child sex abuse, they're not going to care about Russian policy.
Yeah,
but
true.
That's the partisan moment that we're in.
And just to pick up on the point you made about they didn't allow, if we're talking about Trump foreign policy, we're not just talking about Trump the man, we're talking about the administration. And Heather very usefully pointed out, how the establishment did manage to get its own people into there, and that, Steve Bannon is gone, but, John Kelly took over. Just let me turn to Bill and Matt, and Bill first. How worried should we be about the idea of so-called grown-ups? Because I hear this line all the time. And the fact is he surrounded himself with these three generals, his chief of staff, his national security advisor, his defense secretary, 2 retired, 1 serving. And a lot of liberals are delighted. You hear a lot of Democrats saying all the time, it's great these generals are there saving us. Now, as someone who's quite skeptical about the role played by US generals, both in foreign policy and domestic policy, how much faith should we have that these are the guys who are going to save us from the worst elements of a Trump foreign policy?
Well, it's a case of a low bar. It's kind of like under other circumstances we would say, well, this is some mixture of a military coup and the military-industrial complex. In fact, he's appointed so many people from defense industry to so many posts that John McCain says no more. It's done. Secretary of Defense, your White House Chief of Staff, Secretary of the Air Force, Secretary of the Army, top 3 positions in the Pentagon, all to Lockheed, Boeing, Textron, and so forth. In fact, there was an interesting speech. The UAE defense minister spoke at their air show, their weapons show, to an audience of the U.S. UAE Business Council and the Aerospace Industries Association to give this rant about how Iran is a bigger threat than al-Qaeda. And a lot of the people that are funded by these corporations, think tanks and such, are going to take the same line. So you've got this kind of unholy alliance. And, of course, some of the generals, like Mattis, wanted to attack Iran when he had the ability to do so in response to the role of Iranian-trained militias in Iraq. When he was asked what the biggest threat was, he said it was Iran, Iran, and Iran. So I don't think we should be too sanguine about the role of the adults. I think, as Matt pointed out, there are some areas where they're better than not. And it's sort of like if your choice is Steve Bannon or a general, at least a general has seen what war is. They're kind of reality-based. They believe in climate change. So it's really about where the bar is set, I think.
Can I just jump in on that? Because I also think we now know enough, and we all pretend that we're so sophisticated that in our adult life we analyze other countries and we tell you very fine-grained things about other countries, right? So generals, just like all white guys are not alike, all 4-star generals are not alike, all women are not alike. And look, Kelly is a true believer. We can look at Kelly thinks that what ICE is doing is fine. Kelly thinks that it is not okay to question military officers. Kelly thinks that members of Congress should sit down and shut up when confronted by folks from the executive branch. So you got to move him you got to move him out of the believes in democratic institutions category. And so then you're left with 3 or maybe 2.5, depending on how you understand Tillerson, which is like a whole nother 45-minute panel discussion all by itself. So I do think it points, back to this sort of that the Republican establishment, it turns out maybe they care about not getting into a nuclear exchange, and they're very happy that these guys are there, hopefully to prevent that. But there's an awful lot short of getting into a nuclear exchange.
That's what I was going to say. Again, it's all about low bars.
Yeah.
So, okay, we don't have a nuclear war for 8 years. Wow. But we do escalate in Afghanistan. We do, that was all McMaster and Mattis. Trump didn't really want to do that. That was very much from his quote-unquote general. So, yeah, it depends where you set the bar. One final question I'm going to put to Matt before we open up to the audience, which is this idea of... come back to the point Heather made about, okay, he has a value. It's a bad value. It's kind of nationalistic, racist, xenophobic, whatever we want to call it. But this idea that how do you analyze, and I would ask this to a group of domestic politicians as well, how do you analyze a president like Trump who doesn't just believe anything, and we could talk about but doesn't know anything? So this idea, we had George W. Bush. People might remember when George W. Bush was running for president in 2000, he did an interview. We couldn't name the president of Pakistan. He said, the general. And he was mocked for it at the time. How can he not know who the president of Pakistan is as he's running for? Bush looks like Socrates right now compared to the current president. And this is a president who doesn't. Not only does he not know anything, he takes great pride in not knowing anything. So how, as an analyst, do you sit in the Senate or do you sit in a think tank and say, okay, this is what's going to happen next. This is what we try and plan for. This is the current thing. When you have a president who, by the day, can go from saying Saudi was behind 9/11 to saying Saudi's my closest ally in the world, can say, I can't talk about Rohingya because I don't know what Myanmar is. If you said Myanmar to Trump, I don't think he's ever heard the word before. How do you deal with that? Professionally.
Yeah. I'm sorry. There's just no way to sound smart on this question. One is just trying to understand, as I was saying before, the things that Trump needs psychologically for himself,
Indeed.
things that satisfy him, looking at people in the past and currently who've been successful at influencing him, who are the people who have kind of channels to him. But I would think, I just want to, something Heather said that I think was really spot on in that regards to like this part of the Republican conservative constituency that has been kind of, cultivated and affirmed in kind of, whether you call it a dog whistle or just a straight whistle kind of way, but always kept out of power. The kind of person who watches Fox News and sees the things about, the new Black Panther Party or, Sharia law coming to, Nebraska. And one of those viewers has now become president. And so understanding, what do we do now? And what is the establishment? How do they react when they're confronted with someone who kind of believes this stuff and seems to want to act on some of it?
And says to his advisors 3 times in one meeting, why can't we use nuclear weapons? Let's take some questions from the floor. Let's take them 3 at a time. Gentleman here. Wait, there's a microphone coming.
Hi, my name is Joel Yudkin. I run a consulting called High Road Strategies. A couple points. One is I thought Heather's point on the fact that we should be talking about domestic economic policy and foreign, especially on the trade connection, I think is one of the obvious connections. But the thing I really wanted to get to is I feel in the discussion, and you're already moving that direction around, talking about these so-called adults in the room. I feel like Trump is like this bright, weird light that we're all real attracted to. We can't, like moths to a flame. We're kind of so focused on that. And yet I think some of the real action and the focus that we should be looking at maybe more at the so-called adults or the people behind the scenes. And I think they were taken by surprise by Trump too initially, but I think I'm wondering if now they're saying, wait a minute, okay, this guy's going to we can't control this guy. He's just going to do all this weird stuff. But behind the scenes, as long as we don't go to nuclear war, because I think they don't want to, they're smart enough that doesn't serve anybody. They recognize that. But I think you're right. They also aren't looking for policies, domestic, foreign, military policies that are really good policies from our standpoint. Is it, so maybe we should be looking more at what's going on behind the scenes, or is there divisions within that we don't understand yet? But maybe instead of focusing so much on what Trump is saying.
Okay, good question. We'll take 2 more. We'll take them in 3s.
Who was next?
It's gentleman here.
Yeah. My name's Tony Dunkelberger. I'm wondering, with so many ambassadorships and consul positions unfilled across the globe, how do these key vacancies affect the foreign policy and economic policy of the United States moving forward?
Okay. And then the gentleman, actually, we'll take the lady here, and then we'll take the next round. We'll go to that gentleman.
Hi, my name is Jean Athey. I'm a peace activist in Montgomery County, and I wonder if, everyone is sort of taking this sanguine view that the so-called adults are going to prevent Trump from starting a nuclear war with North Korea, and I'm not at all convinced that that is the case, and I'm not at all convinced that they could stop him if he wanted to do it, and legally he can. And I've heard discussions by people in the former Secretary of Defense saying if he wants to do that, we have to follow through. And so, as we all know, that would be catastrophic, but Trump is supposedly has said, well, it'll be over there. So I'd like to comment on that.
And in fact, not just Trump, I believe Lindsey Graham said something similar as well. Senators, it's over there. In fact, Gabriel Sherman of Vanity Fair wrote a piece recently that there was talk of Mattis and Kelly had discussed jumping on Trump to stop him from firing nukes, actually physically tackling him. That's the situation we reached. Since we're on nuclear war, let's kick off with the last question first and work our way backwards. Bill, how hard would it be to stop Donald Trump from launching a nuclear war? I mean, if you had to say now, what are the odds of a nuclear war in the next 3 years?
Yikes. Well, I think what you should do is you have to punch in codes. So just give them the wrong codes. I think that's probably the best defense. Somebody would have to basically commit an act of civil disobedience to stop him, because under law, he can do it without consulting anyone. There's been a movement in the Congress to try to have a law. Markey Liu is one example, that he would have to come to Congress before launching a first strike. Now, is he the kind of person who would do that? Can we get that through Congress? But at least it's putting it higher on the agenda. And Senator Corker is having hearings on this tomorrow, which hasn't happened since Nixon. It's probably not a surprise, since Nixon had his own issues. So as for percentage, I personally don't think it's going to happen. I don't know what the percentage is. It's partly just a gut feeling. It's not based on careful calculation. But it's, the fact that there's a percentage risk at all, I think that risk is too high. And I think it's higher under Trump than it's been in a long time.
And Matt, just melding that question with the gentleman's first question about the so-called adults in the room, the divisions between them and what they're bringing to the body. I saw John Kelly saying this morning, he was asked about the North Korea tweet, and he said, well, I don't waste time reading tweets, which seems kind of bizarre given the guy you work for is basically executing foreign policy via Twitter, so you might want to check his Twitter feed from time to time, because you can bet your bottom dollar Kim Jong-un's people are checking his Twitter feed.
Right. I think that gives me an opportunity to make a point I wanted to make earlier, which is not only should we be cautious about the ability of the so-called adults to act as adults, but we should be cautious about imputing certainty to the consensus that these adults supposedly represent. And I think the point about Afghanistan is a really important one. The idea that the serious, smart move was, after 16 years, to double down again in Afghanistan. I think we should be careful about accepting that. I think one of the lessons of the 2016 election was that large numbers of Americans feel that this quote-unquote consensus has not delivered for them, either in domestic policy or in foreign policy. And I think Trump certainly exploited that in what I see as a very destructive and divisive way. But we should be open to that and think about, has this consensus really delivered? Does it need to be seriously questioned? I think the answer is yes. I think we could probably have a much longer panel about where exactly that consensus has failed and is wrong. But I think we should be open.
H.R. McMaster, who's regarded as this kind of brainiac, intellectual, scholar, warrior, whatever, praise the op-eds give him. He went on Fox News and said North Korea cannot be deterred like other countries, which is obviously a quite extreme position. Susan Rice's predecessor didn't take that position. But I guess it again comes back to the grading on a curve, the low bars. He's not Trump, so we give him more respect and credibility. In another administration, we would be more sceptical, I think, to take the gentleman's question about the Mattises, the Kellys, the McMasters, and exploring their views a bit more. Is that fair?
Very much.
Okay. And then does anyone want to take the question? You could deal with the nuclear question and also the State Department being gutted question, no ambassadors.
Yeah, so look, the State Department is not being gutted because of incompetence, although incompetence is certainly helping. The effect that it's having means that your local embassy cannot speak authoritatively on behalf of the U.S., cannot authoritatively engage in any particular dispute or to promote any particular interest or support any particular policy, and that is the intent. And here, again, we do have to say, and this makes me very unpopular in some left of center circles, but this is also not a new thing that Donald Trump made up, that influence has been sort of cascading away from the State Department and toward the Defense Department and the White House since the end of the Cold War. And this is basically taking that trend and accelerating it right off a cliff. But, it's not something that Trump and Tillerson made up. I also wanted to take the gentleman's point on international economic policy and just, again, say, the president has, as I think Matt and Bill have both referenced, the president has a campaign slogan on international economic policy, which was enormously effective. He's then able to go abroad and do and say things that don't line up with his campaign slogan, but manage how he talks to his base in such a way that nobody notices that. He goes to Vietnam and says, well, I gave a really tough speech. I told him when I was in China, and the fact that he didn't actually tell them while he was in China is kind of beside the point. But nobody else in American politics has a coherent answer. What is international economic policy for? What is an international economic policy that would do something for you? Matt and I don't always agree on matters of the 2016 elections, but I will agree wholeheartedly that Trump's sort of cri de coeur about international economic policy was much more effective than anything anybody else had to offer. And that's a major forward-looking problem that economists can help us with.
Much more effective than anyone else has to offer, even Bernie Sanders?
Bernie hasn't. Yes, much more effective than anything anyone else had to offer on international.
Before we go back to the audience, Matt, do you want to come back to that?
I'm okay.
Okay.
There's one point we didn't quite address. Looking at the people behind the scenes, I think if you look at domestic policy, it's somewhat clearer. If you look at regulations and how fast they're being rolled back, environment and elsewhere, I think we need to think about that in foreign policy. The trick is Trump is the commander-in-chief, and he can set the tone. So maybe a little different, but I think both the press and analysts elsewhere need to attempt to do more of that. Because if you just run from tweet to tweet, you can't think straight. And therefore you can't analyze, and therefore you can't be helpful.
Yeah, I will just very briefly say, part of what I think Senator Sanders brought and continues to bring is recognizing that the ineffectiveness of the consensus in addressing some of these needs. I don't want to get too far into it. But I think we can all agree that Trump exploited that very, very effectively, in part because, these are things that had been fed on that side of the aisle for a long time, and he was very, very keyed into that. But as I said, I think there's a much more constructive and positive way to kind of address those questions, and I think that's the challenge now.
But it is amazing that you can run your whole campaign, go from rally to rally saying, China's raping us, and then go to China and say, I had the best trip ever, it was amazing, we loved hanging out at the Great Wall, and your base says nothing. Right. Let's go back and take 3 questions again. Gentleman here has been waiting very patiently in the yellow shirt, yes?
Hi, Robert Sheretta, President of International Investor. I never thought I'd be in position of defending Donald Trump, but I've heard a repeat of a lot of criticisms here, so let me throw 2 back at this panel.
Yeah.
One, have we ever had a coherent foreign policy? On one hand, where we're supporting an Israel, on the other hand, a Saudi Arabia, are any of those ever consistent with the ideals of this nation? The second, the Asian trip, you kind of were throwing some heat on them for that. The fact of the matter is, when you're in somebody's house, you may not be insulting to them. What counts is when you come back, are you going to criticize them and move a policy forward in any direction? That's where I think he could deserve criticism. But I'd like to return to the title of this panel and hear a little bit more about Iran. If you look at a map, you see we've got Afghanistan on one side to the east of Iran. You've got Iraq to the west. across the Persian Gulf, you've got Saudi Arabia, the UAE. It seems that from the Iranian point of view, we certainly haven't been on their side for quite a few years. They feel threatened in a lot of respects. So I wonder if we need, a new style of thinking when it comes to our entire approach to Iran as well.
Okay, so we'll take two more very quickly, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Take two brief questions. Lady there, yes.
Hi, thank you for this. I'm part of a network of psychiatrists, psychologists called Duty to Warn, which you probably have heard of, about warning about his mental state.
A fantastic new book based off.
Pardon me?
And there's a fantastic new book based off the back of that.
Oh, okay. And I mean, the point that they're making, I used to be a therapist, is also that he's impulsive, paranoid, and narcissistic. But also from a cognitive and developmental point of view, he also has cognitive impairments, like he doesn't understand cause and effect and doesn't process information. So what about that? And just as an aside, also that I think, so now that some Democrats are winning, I think it's really important to try to reach out to people who who he makes them feel good, and a lot of humiliation. And I love Danica Rome, that just won, was asked about how she's going to treat the guy she defeated.
She said he's
the homophobe. She said, "Well, he's my constituent. I'm not going to disrespect." So I think we need to deal with the humiliation and the elitism, and not humiliate people.
And Jamie, do you want to come in? You had a point?
It's a very interesting discussion, and one of the things I would be tempted to take away from it is that when a U.S. administration lacks a coherent policy, then the initiative is going to lie with those countries that do have coherent strategies and are building on a longer time horizon. And in particular, I'd like any comment you might have about the position of China in this. And as a closely related remark, I just want to call your attention to the fact that within about 2 days of the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, we had the picture of a allegedly billionaire capitalist president of the United States standing on the red carpet in Tiananmen Square, listening to the People's Liberation Army Band play first the Star-Spangled Banner and then the Internationale. And I wonder if, in your experience, you have ever had your irony meters busted to that extent.
Okay. Irony's dead. Irony's dead.
Let's go backwards in that order in the questions. We've almost run out of time, so keep your answers above possible. Bill, do you want to take the China point first in terms of countries that do have coherence versus a country that doesn't?
Arise, you prisoners of starvation. That's from the Internationale for those who are younger. So I think the lack of a strategy lets competitors kind of eat your lunch. I'm concerned about Africa, which doesn't get a lot of attention, but as the world learned after some U.S. troops were killed in Niger, the U.S. has thousands of troops in Africa, thousands of exercises, has almost an entirely military strategy for dealing with terrorism, which has been backfiring. Meanwhile, China is buying up resources, making economic deals. It's like they're playing two different games, and the U.S. is playing the wrong game. Not that the Chinese model is great. I'm not endorsing it, but I'm just saying as a narrow view of who's going to be more powerful and have more quote-unquote wins in the world, the Chinese approach is far superior to the Trump approach.
Heather, just dealing with the point about Trump's mental state. We had Richard Nixon came up with his famous madman theory of deterrence. That was based around the idea of pretending to be a madman. What happens if you have an actual madman running the show? Well,
I think we've seen that Trump endorses that theory as well, or thinks that that's what he's doing. And I may ascribe less importance to the mental state because of some of the comments that were made earlier about the choices made by folks behind the scenes. And because in whatever mental state it is that he's in, Trump nonetheless has this amazing appeal to connect with a certain group of voters who are very loyal to him. and the leadership of the Republican Party is not willing to walk away from him, until his mental state becomes something that's damaging to the fortunes of the Republican Party in red states, then I hate to say this, but it doesn't actually matter all that much.
And the gentleman's question here about, has there ever been a president with a coherent foreign policy?
No. Great power policy is always hypocritical and always inconsistent. I think if you look through history and across nation states, the U.S. is not exceptional in its hypocrisy and inconsistency. What makes a successful presidency versus an unsuccessful one is that you can look at what's said and what's done and derive something understandable from it, and then as a foreign power make choices about how to react to it. And I think the saving grace of American foreign policy that has allowed us to get through the last 75 years as well as we did was that there were always some classes or groups in other countries who looked at what the U.S. was doing and thought there's room for us in what you're doing. And that was never as grandiose or wonderful as universal as we like to tell ourselves it was, but there was always a piece of that. And with Trump, there's really no daylight left for that.
Can I say one
Yes.
quick thing? Well, yes. I mean, the leaders of the free world had no problem overthrowing the government of Iran, of Guatemala, of Chile, of launching the war in Vietnam and Bush's war in Iraq and so forth. So, but I think one thing about Trump is the short-term concerns, because he is so reckless, he's so unpredictable. But certainly, you're correct. There hasn't been a coherent policy that I can remember, even though containment was an idea, but it didn't fit with some of the things that were done.
And Matt, the gentleman's other point was interesting about Iran, seeing it from an Iranian perspective. It's not often what you hear in this town, at least, the idea of Iran feeling threatened, the idea of America being biased against Iran. I interviewed your boss a few weeks ago, Senator Sanders, and he made a quite radical claim about how the United States should perhaps reassess the way it looks at Iran and Saudi and be less pro-Saudi and less anti-Iran. Do you think that's actually realistic, feasible in this town?
It'll be a challenge. But I think there's a very solid case to make is that, listen, if we want a region that's more stable than less stable, the strategy of simply isolating Iran and keeping it out of the region and cordoning it off is not realistic. The U.S. has to make some tough choices. We work with imperfect countries. We are an imperfect country. But I do think, to the gentleman's point, the U.S. invaded and occupied countries onto Iran's east and west. We need to understand how that might impact their strategic perception. I would make one last point, however, about, the U.S.'s past and the way Trump views the U.S. as a moral actor. Certainly recognizing the things the U.S. has done. I think Bill ran down the list of some of them. But I think what's troubling, even someone who recognizes hypocrisy, it always exists, but at least hypocrisy pays service to some kind of higher ideal.
Yeah.
And I think there's value in that, and I think there's something very problematic when Trump responds to claims about, Vladimir Putin's jailing and killing of journalists. Well, we do that too. I think that is something different.
We have run over on our time, but we're going to wrap up. We have to finish now because you're about to get some remarks from one of Congress's rising stars who's arrived there in the corner. I will leave you. I think Bill had the line that I think most of us signed up to, which is, does he have a coherent foreign policy? He's coherently incoherent. And if that makes you feel better, let me leave you with the line from the ghostwriter of The Art of the Deal, who said last year to New Yorker magazine that everything he knows about working with Trump makes him think that the world will end on Trump's watch. So I'll leave you with that cheery note. Thank you very much.